So, good morning to all of you, dear participants. At the onset, am I audible? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am. It's everything is clear.
Okay. Sorry for the delay. Yes. So, at the onset, I would like to thank the Vice Chancellor of Central University of Karnataka, the head department of History and Archaeology, the coordinators, Dr. Arjun and his whole team for giving me this opportunity to speak on this 3-day online workshop. The topic of my presentation is Human and Animal Interactions in the Indus Valley Civilization, Recent Studies and New Insights. So yes, all of us have read about the Indus Valley Civilization in our school textbooks. And as we all know that this particular civilization, one of the world's oldest to have flourished somewhere in what is the present day Pakistan and northwestern parts of India, mainly places like districts like the Haryana, Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and coming quite close to the borders with Maharashtra. So this particular civilization, which flourished nearly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago in the Indus Valley, has
Hello, ma'am.
offered. Hello.
Sorry for the interruption. Can you go for a slideshow?
Okay. Yes. So this particular civilization, which is nearly 5,000 years old, survived for so many years, carrying out as one of the earliest, you can say, development of city kind of life in this particular part of South Asia. So it has always enamored a lot of archaeologists who have been interested in the archaeology of this particular civilization. Now, due to the large number of sites which have been discovered, also the kind of material culture which has been recovered, along with a lot of radiocarbon dates, AMS dates which have been obtained, it has been possible to get relative and absolute chronology for this particular civilization. So today we know that this particular civilization had its very early beginnings going far back, maybe till the 6th or the 7th millennium BC, and it flourished right up till say 1700 to 1600 BC time period, during which it has gone through various phases of development, starting with an early phase, then the mature phase where the civilization was at its zenith, saw a lot of developmental activities, expansion activities, and then slowly it started declining somewhere around the 1900 BC, which continued right up till the second millennium. So this civilization in that sense has been very interesting. And it has been interesting because for the first time we have the development of cities in South Asia, succeeding the Neolithic period, and what we see is monumental architecture, use of bricks, planning, rich material culture with objects of terracotta, copper, faience, stone, shell objects, and so forth. We see a lot of craft specialization activities where pottery was being manufactured, there was shell working being carried out, stone bead making was being carried out. We also see the development of both external and internal trade, and there were very large trade networks which were existing within the Indus Valley as well as its adjoining areas, going as far as Mesopotamia and places like Oman in the UAE. We also see a lot of technological advancements in this, with especially related with, say, stone technologies. Then you have that is manufacture of stone blades, and you have the copper technology, bead making, and so on. We also have we see that during this particular time period, definitely the whole society was very well organized. It probably had some kind of a controlling authority, because the kind of material culture which you see throughout the whole civilization is fairly homogeneous. You do not see a lot of, there are to a certain extent regional variations which start towards the later, towards its end phase, that is maybe during the late Harappan period, when a lot of regionalization occurs and there are regional influences. But during the mature Harappan period, the kind of objects which you get, like if you find a shell bangle, for example, it's the same thing what you would get, say, at Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, or what you would get in Gujarat. So such kind of similarity which is there, it is definitely, it signifies, and even the standards of weights and measures which are there, very, very standardized, which indicates that there was definitely some kind of a central controlling authority which was controlling this whole entire civilization. Religion has also been a part, where you have the depiction of the Pashupati seals which are there, and there were fire altars which have been discovered at Kalibangan, but anyway, I am not going to too much depth about it. Uh, we also have the script in this particular Harappan times, but unfortunately, unlike what we see for the Egyptian or for the Mesopotamian civilization, the script has not been yet deciphered, due to which a lot of our information about the cultural life phase or the daily activities which the people were having during the civilization, it still remains sort of not uncovered or undeciphered. Another interesting aspect which needs to be considered here is that such a big civilization with so much of things happening, trade and manufacture of goods and craft specialization, there were craft activities, there were people probably doing farming and agriculture and so many other economic activities. So what were the people eating? What was their diet like? So today we have a lot of paleobotanical and archaeozoological remains which have been recovered from these large number of sites all across the Indus Valley. And these have been studied by specialists like the paleobotanist and the archaeozoologist, who are able to tell you what was the subsistence or what was the dietary pattern of the Harappans during, or what was their food economy during the Harappan times. So I will be dwelling on what the diet, which was animal based also. So I'll be speaking and focusing more on this particular aspect. So before we go into more depths into the Indus Valley and its animal exploitation, we need to consider here the evidences which come from Mehergarh. Now, it is intriguing to know that this civilization, which suddenly emerges in South Asia, what was happening before, say, 5,000 years before it, or before the 3rd or 4th millennium BC? What was the situation in South Asia? Were there such big cities around, and did they have some kind of influence into the development of the Indus Valley civilization? Many of these answers still remain unanswered, because we do not have that much of data of such kind of sites being excavated. The only very beautiful or very exciting site which has been discovered is that of Mehergarh, which is situated in Balochistan. And this particular site is interesting because it has given you a whole long cultural sequence of human occupation in South Asia, which begins somewhere around 7th millennium BC and continues right up till the 2nd millennium BC. And it is here that we see the development of introduction of, in the early periods, there is no ceramics. Then you start seeing and people were mostly hunting and gathering. They were not so settled. But as we go towards the later phases of this particular culture at Mehergarh, we find that people started domesticating animals. They were using domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, goat. They were also doing hunting. In the meanwhile, they were having burials which were decorated, where the skeletons were decorated with ornaments which were being made up of seashells, which were coming all the way from, say, the Makaran coast, because Mehergarh is a site which is located very, very far inland. It is not on the coast. So you see at 7th millennium BC, there was so much of interactions which were already going on in South Asia with the highlands as well as the coastal people. So in this sense, Mehergarh fauna, which was studied by Richard Meadow, has been a like a yardstick for understanding the development of the archaeozoological findings which we see from the Indus Valley civilization. So going back to Indus Valley civilization, what are the sources from which we can reconstruct this human-animal interactions? So basically we have three sources. One is the kind of depictions which we see of animals on pottery seals. I mean, you have to just open, and maybe students can Google and look for images of animal figurines from the Harappan civilization, and you will find so many images. Similarly, we see depictions on pottery, we see terracotta figurines, we see objects which are made up of bone, ivory, and shell. So animals were being depicted in a very large scale. You also see the depictions on seals, which are again, for example, you see the humped bull, you see the rhinoceros, you see the unicorn, and so forth. But you know, these objects and these depictions to a certain extent have their limitations, because many of these have been mostly found at the major urban centers, like say your Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, or Lothal for that matter, and not many could be available from the smaller settlements, which are also a very important part of the Indus Valley civilization. It is not just that the Indus Valley was all about Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, but there were also a lot of smaller settlements which had contributed to the development of the civilization. So it is here that the third source, that is the kind of archaeozoological assemblages which we have recovered from many of the Harappan sites all across the Indus Valley, for example, skeletal parts like bones, teeth, shells, horns, are a very, very important source. And these are in a way a direct source for studying and carrying out any kind of reconstruction of the kind of animals which were utilized by these Harappans during the various phases of the civilization. Bones, teeth, shells, horns, I'm sure you all are familiar with it, especially for people who eat meat, would have chewed on bones, and you see them in your food. You might have also seen dead carcasses lying on the sink, so you are familiar with skeletons. So bones, teeth, shell, horns, antlers are one of the most well preserved remains, and South Asia in a way is very, very lucky in that sense, because these are very well preserved in our dry arid conditions, semi arid conditions, and which make a very, very interesting study for us, because a lot, due to their good preservation, we can gather a lot of information by just studying these remains. So our methods, so I'll be focusing on the archaeozoological assemblages, and the main studies which have been carried out on them are basically application of archaeozoology. Now, what is archaeozoology? It is nothing but the study of such kind of animal remains which are found at archaeological sites. Today, it's a very important branch of archaeology, and all over the world, there are a lot of practicing archaeozoologists. You have any excavation programs, be related to any of the prehistoric or protohistoric or historic period sites, you will have archaeozoologists who are involved in these programs and who study about the remains. So some very important studies have been done for Neolithic sites like Çatalhöyük, where people have not only just told about how animals were being eaten, but even the smells of the dung and things like that, or the symbolic aspects of using animals, has been widely discussed. So archaeozoology is a very important study which is carried out in archaeology. Then you can also apply scanning electron microscopy, because you can look at the bones under a scanning SEM, and this will give you more in-depth into the kind of bone alteration or the scratch marks or cut marks which can be seen on the bones. Dating is very important, because very often sometimes we may not have dates from a particular site, and so the archaeozoologist could use the bones for dating. And we also use, in recent years, a lot of stable isotope analysis is being used. That is, archaeozoology is not only just doing quantitative and qualitative analysis, but we are also employing a lot of scientific techniques like stable isotopes and ancient DNA for getting much more information from the bones besides their identification and other cultural role. So let us look at, so archaeozoological methods basically are of two stages. The first is in the field. The archaeozoologist has to be involved in any excavation program, as I said earlier. This is because previously the tendency was that, you know, archaeozoologists used to be contacted after excavations were over. Then when the people would come back to the university departments, and they would just casually hand over the bones to you and just ask you to identify them. But this is not so. Today, it has to be very systematically done, and it starts with the beginning of excavations, where archaeozoologists who are involved will be systematically recording, collecting, and even doing some preliminary investigations like their identifications on the site itself. So a lot of our dirty work could be finished on the site itself, and then they are brought to the laboratory where we do the further studies. So here, the pictures which I'm showing you are basically from the recently excavated site of Rakhigadi by Professor V. Shinde from our ex-VC from our department. And this is our on-site analysis which was being done. The second stage of any archaeozoological study would be inside the laboratory. This is because this is where most of our reference collection is there. And today in India, we are probably at Deccan College, we are the only one of its kind in South Asia where we have housed reference collections of modern day animals, mostly all kinds of wild as well as domestic mammals. We do not have such a good fish collection yet, and so we use these reference collections for carrying out our identifications, because most of the material which comes out of excavations, the animal remains, they are never complete. They are small, very sometimes unidentifiable fragments. So these need to be compared and then identified. So here, excuse me, here we need to have a very good knowledge of animal osteology. And students, let me tell you this, that it's not necessary to be a very high-flying zoologist to be doing these kind of studies. Many of us have probably had a science background. I was a BSc with zoology and geology, but through our practice and training, we have been able to acquire training in learning how to identify these animals. So we have a good knowledge of osteology, which we have built up over the years. So it is nothing to be, it's not a very intimidating science, which only is supposed to be done by certain kind of people. So please do not go by this notion. I think anybody can do it. It's a lot of hard work. So anybody who is wanting to do and interested can always do this kind of research. So besides identification of the animals, we also do things, look at their preservation, whether they are broken, cut marks, modifications, and other alterations, like there could be burning activity on them, the bones could be charred. So all this information is going to tell us that what had happened to the animal in the past, what had people done with it exactly. Was the animal butchered for obtaining meat, or was it butchered for some other reason, or was it just accidentally it had been introduced into a site. So all this information is very useful at the time when we are doing our final interpretation. We also take a lot of bone measurements, because this helps us in finding out the height of the animals, the size of the animals. It also helps us to separate species, wild from domestic. So bone measurements are also very important. We also do aging and sexing of bones, because we are interested in knowing that the animals which were being brought to a particular site, at what age were they being killed? Were they young animals, or were they old animals, or were they like semi-adult? And these things are very important, especially when you are trying to reconstruct the animal utilization pattern at a particular site. For example, if we have a lot of young animals, it is always seen that I don't eat meat, but there are people who are non-vegetarian, and they would probably be able to say that meat of younger animals like lambs may taste much better than those of older animals. So it is quite likely that a lot of younger animals were being hunted mainly for obtaining the meat. Sometimes we have also a lot of older animals might be kept for some other purposes, not just for eating meat. And quantification is also important because we need to tell you at a particular site that we need to do comparisons between animals, that how many sheep goat were exploited as against how many say cattle were exploited. So this gives us a whole fair idea about the distribution of animals at a particular site, and also sorry animals at a particular settlement. So these are some of the, so today in present times, in the past 50 years, since the first excavation reports which came out for Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, in which the faunal remains were studied for the first time by people like Sivailan Guha and Prashad for Harappa. And since then, a lot of faunal studies have been carried out for many of the Harappan sites which have been discovered and excavated in India. We find that not much work is now coming out of Pakistan, maybe because of the political issues. Some important sites which have been studied beside Mohenjo-daro and Harappa is sites called Aladino and Balakot. But major focus today, what we see of Harappan faunal studies, we are finding has been done in the Indian subcontinent, in sites based in Gujarat as well as in northern India, in Punjab, Haryana, and Rajasthan. So a lot of our work, which we have been doing archaeozoologists, we are a very small team. And so we have been doing this kind of research at Deccan College. And so most of our publications which you will see on Harappan faunal studies are coming from our laboratory at Deccan College. So we have major contributors to the archaeofaunal and from our department. So these are some of the sites which have been studied in Gujarat, a large number of. In fact, Gujarat is one of the very well studied domains of the Indus Valley civilization. And partly this is done by both Deccan College as well as MS University, Baroda. So you have many important sites like Nageshwar, Bagasra, Kuntasi, Loteshwar, Nagwada, and Surkotada, which have been studied. Now, coming to northern India, in recent years, in the past 10 years, we find that northern India has also emerged as a very important region for understanding the Indus Valley civilization. And this is because the large number of explorations which have taken place, as well as the excavations which have been initiated in these past few years. For examples like Farmana, Mithatal, Rakhigadi, Birhana, Banavli, Kunal, and so forth. So what is interesting about these sites is that these are not just belonging to the mature phase of the Indus Valley civilization, but these have yielded some very, very early levels. So this becomes interesting to understand the kind of cultural developments which have occurred during the Indus Valley civilization, right from the beginning of its, say, being initiated till its very late phase. So here it is also a very important region, therefore, for understanding the interactions which happened between humans and animals in this particular region, going back to its very early Harappan times. And for certain sites like, say, Kunal, Rakhigadi, Birhana, we find that they have also a phase which precedes the early Harappan phase, and that is the Hakra phase. Such kind of sites are there present in the Cholistan part of Pakistan, but not many of them have been excavated. So our information about the animal exploitation which was happening in these very, very early stages, besides Mehergarh, is not very... Yeah, so I was talking about the North India, parts of Haryana, Rajasthan, and Punjab, which are now showing to a lot of promise for understanding the early development of the Indus Valley civilization, as well as it is also an important area for understanding animal exploitation from the early to the mature Harappan period. So a lot of studies are being done in this particular region. Some recent studies which have been carried out are for sites like Farmana, Birana, Kunal, and more recently we are also working on the faunal remains from Rakhigadi. So this is the site of Birana. So at Birana, we have cultural phases which are starting from the Hakra phase, and our recent work at the site has shown that it also goes back from the radiocarbon dates which have been obtained as well as OSL dating which has been done. It shows that this particular site can go back as contemporary with Mehergarh, and it is also can be classified as one of the oldest Harappan settlements in the region. So at this particular site also we see a lot of animals being exploited, beginning with hunting was being practiced. So coming to the archaeofaunal record which we have got from these particular sites which have been excavated and studied, we see that most of the animal remains which came to be at these sites were from two processes. Basically, they were from intentional, that is where they were being brought for a specific purpose, maybe dietary as raw materials for all different kinds of purposes, like even obtaining secondary products like milk, ghee, curds, etc. Some of them were also accidentally introduced, which may be because of keeping as being in contact with animals which are sort of roaming around these settlements. They could be rats, they could be mongoose, they could be even some of these carnivores, predators which are there, snakes and so forth. So from the record which has been obtained so far, we see that animals in the Harappa had played a very important role in the Harappan economy. It was definitely multifaceted. A very diverse range of animals were being exploited, and this was for basically a large proportion of animals were used in the diet of the people. They were also meant for obtaining secondary products. And how do we find out this? Because as I had mentioned earlier, that when we look at the age profiles of the animals, if we are finding more of younger cattle, say, these may have been, the cows may have been kept for obtaining meat, say, not meat, milk. Many of the other animals like sheep, goat were also being kept at a very younger age. This again must be for obtaining secondary products. We also see the use of antlers, bones, ivory, shells, fish vertebrae as raw material for making all kinds of objects, be it tools like bone tools. We have a lot of shell working, ivory working which is carried out. We also see the use of probably dogs as pets, because we have got terracotta figurines from, this is probably from Harappa, but at Rakhigadi we have found a terracotta figurine of a dog with a collar around its neck, and we presume that this must have been kept like a pet, maybe for security or just for entertainment. We also see the use of animals in as traction, like bullocks, buffalo. Here I will not say anything in my presentation about horse, because the very little evidence has been obtained for horse, and there is a lot of doubts expressed over the skeletal parts of the horse remains which have been found. And many of the experts like Richard Meadow feel that this is not the actual horse, but they may be of, say, either the wild ass, because the wild ass or the bones of the donkey and horses are definitely very close or very similar in their skeletal characters. And in the absence of a good reference collection, it has really become difficult to say with certainty that the bones of horse have been found at many of the sites. So firstly, the evidence is also very limited, and because of the doubts which have been expressed, the horse is sort of kept in a cupboard. It will emerge only when more intense research is done regarding this particular animal. So that is about the horse. Certain animals like the humped bull, unicorn, which are expressed on the seals and ceilings, are definitely for signifying some kind of status, maybe in religious activities or in rituals. Now, the humped bull is also, if you look at cattle herds, even today, you will find a solitary bull which is accompanying a herd of cows. So it sort of signifies even a lot of power, strength. and so was with the unicorn also. We also see a lot of wild carnivores which are represented, like you have the Panthera pardus has been found at sites like Birana. We also see the presence of wolf, fox. So the kind of archaeological studies which have been done so far. So besides giving a cultural role to the animals which have been found, we are also able to learn about the kind of faunal diversity which was in these regions at that particular time, say around 5,000 years ago, what sort of animals were living in the vicinity of these settlements. The subsistence pattern of the Harappans, we see basically use of a very variety of domestic and wild animals. Domestic, a very wide range, majority were mostly cattle, that is made of the cow and oxen. And we also see the use of buffalo. And we are still not sure that the buffalo was domesticated in the Indus Valley or not. Then we also see a lot of bones of sheep and goat and pigs which were introduced. Maybe the pigs could have been introduced in a much later time, because in the early levels so far at Birana and Mehergarh, what we are finding is mostly of cattle. Wild animals also, we see a very diverse range of animals being used and exploited by the Harappans who were carrying out hunting. So we have presence of the gaur, wild buffalo, nilgai, black buck, chital, sambar, and some of these animals, though belonging to some very different ecological habitats. For example, the gaur stays in very, very forested environments. The wild buffalo stays in very swampy, watery conditions. Now the nilgai, black buck, chital are more of the grassland variety. So it has been able to find out the kind of ecological habitats which these animals were exploited from. We also see a good appreciable amount of aquatic remains or aquatic fauna in the archaeological remains, and these were probably from the rivers, lakes, which were found present in the region. They were also exploiting some of the marine animal resources, like they were doing marine fishing, plus collection of shells, crustaceans, and so forth. So what we are finding is that definitely the Harappans had adopted a very mixed subsistence strategy, which was comprising of cattle rearing, herding. You have sheep goat pastoralism was also a part of it. We see them hunting of wild animals, fishing both from freshwater and marine, trapping of small animals. So all kinds of activities were there which had involved in exploitation of animals from very, very different ecological zones. Now, these are some of the pictures which I would like to show you of the humped cattle bones which we have found. Now, the humped cattle can be identified from our archaeological remains is from this bifid thoracic vertebra, which is in our, it is one of the thoracic vertebrae which is found in our chest region, and not the chest, the back of in our back region, and this because it has got a bifid, and that is where the hump of the ox, or you find it in this humped cattle, and this is a very characteristic feature by which we can identify the humped cattle. We also see a lot of phalanges, that is bones from the hooves, and bones from the limbs, which are showing cut marks, which tell us that this particular animal was eaten, it was kept for obtaining milk, and then also kept, older animals kept for mating purposes, they were kept for pulling bullock carts, as well as in agriculture activities like plowing, etc. So you see the hunting of wild animals such as gaur, nilgai. So we have used our osteological collections which we have at Deccan College to identify some of these animals, because we have the modern collections are there with us, modern skeletons of gaur, not the gaur, we have only the skull of gaur at Deccan College, but we have bones of the nilgai, then antelopes, and so forth. So these collections definitely have helped us in our identification of these animals from the Harappan context. So these are some of the wild varied herbivores which you can see, the chinkara, chital, and their respective bones. Now this is not a very easy task, because most of the bones, as I said earlier, are highly fragmented, and it becomes very difficult to at times distinguish between bones also. So we have to spend a lot of time going back and forth between our reference collections and our archaeological samples just to come up with a definite species identification. Now, fishing activities of the Harappans have been identified. Definitely the Harappans were doing fishing, and it is not surprising because many of the sites which are there in Gujarat have yielded a lot of fish remains. Fish remains were not only seen at coastal sites, but we have sites like Harappa, which is located so much inland, where they were bringing in dried fish, which was probably of marine origin, brought from the, say, the Makran coast, and taken all the way inside up till Harappa. So you can see the ingenuity of the people, that they were transporting fish so far inland also just for the sake of eating. And for this, we have depictions on pots, we have net sinkers, we have fish hooks, we have depictions of even fish nets, so we can find out the kind of fishing the people were doing, whether it was from estuarine waters or whether it was from the deep sea and so forth. Here, I would like to add that I think for any archaeological interpretation, it's always very important to also carry out ethnographic studies on the side, because South Asia is a very rich storehouse of such kind of cultural data which is even available today. So from these ethnographic examples, we can try and at least identify some of the techniques which are used in the past, or the kind of methodologies which people might have adopted for exploiting certain animals. So ethnoarchaeology, ethnographic sources are very useful in such kind of reconstructions. So here we can see some of the dietary use of freshwater turtles. A lot of turtle remains have been found from many of the sites in, say, in northern India, especially in Haryana. And today, if you see sites like Banavali, Bhirana, which were on the banks of the Ghaggar, also supposed to be the famous Saraswati, and today we find that these are all very dried up riverbeds. But our archaeological data shows that in the past, during the Harappan times, definitely the Ghaggar River had much more water. It was able to support a lot of varieties of freshwater fish as well as turtles. So along with, say, your freshwater mussels, which the people might have exploited as food. For example, if you take the site of Rakhi Gadi also, today if you go around Rakhi Gadi, you do not see much of water bodies. Even at the lakes and thing, you do not see much of shell remains which are, or the mollusks which are growing there. But within the site, they have found and reported large quantities of freshwater bivalves, shells. So which signify that at certain point of time during the site's occupation, the rivers and lakes had plentiful water supply. So this also helps us to understand the kind of environmental conditions which were present around the site in the past. So here you can see some of the marine mollusks which have been used as food. So at some of the coastal sites in Gujarat, for example, we also see a lot of marine shells which were eaten, for example, oysters, clams, then some of the gastropods like this telescopium. So people were not only using the terrestrial mammals, and they were also using a lot of these marine or brackish water animal resources for their dietary purposes. It is to be also seen that in Gujarat, maybe by the late Harappan times, because of very drought-like conditions, increasing aridity, a lot of cultivation also was not being made possible. So there must have been a very large-scale reliance on animal resources for food. Besides this, we find that animals were being exploited as raw materials. So here we see that the Indus Valley civilization should be credited for having one of the largest intensive exploitation of shell resources, which are basically coming from the Arabian Sea, that is the Gulf of Kutch, and they were making them for their ornaments, for making such kind of objects. For example, you can see the bowl-shaped container, which are known as the famous ladles, which are made from this muricid gastropod. You can see the bangles which were being made, and these were being distributed all across the Indus Valley. Not only in the Indus Valley, share this, many of the objects of made in the Indus Valley were being exported as far as Mesopotamia. Some of the sites like Tello have reported such kind of shell ladles in the 3rd millennium BC. So you see that the kind of exchanges which these animal products were also being were undertaken for the movement of goods across the whole region as well as outside the Indus Valley is also very interesting. And if you look at, since we do not have much of written records from the Indus Valley to tell us about what was happening, but in the some of the Mesopotamian texts also give references of buffaloes being transported from Indus Valley. Just imagine a very heavy animal like buffalo being transported all the way up to Mesopotamia. So such kind of references have been there to the distribution and transportation of animals across to other possible regions. So this is the famous rhinoceros. Today we find that the rhinoceros is only in parts of Assam and maybe the Tarai regions of the Himalayas. And our archaeological evidences, which we have got from, say, parts of Rajasthan, parts of Gujarat, from Harappan context, tell us that the rhinoceros was there during the Indus Valley civilization at sites like Lothal, Sukotada, where we have found the animal remains are not found in very large amounts, but we do find a few bones here and there, and from which it has been identified. And probably it was maybe driven to extinction by the Harappans to a certain extent, and maybe the climatic conditions which were already deteriorating by the late Harappan period, which might have sort of seen the destruction of this particular animal or its decline in its habitats, which probably saw the decline in the animal as well. So that is why today we do not find the rhinoceros in parts of Gujarat or say even in other parts of the Indus Valley, but only in places like Assam, where it requires a very wet, swampy kind of wet weather conditions in which it can survive. So these were definitely there at some point of time in the Indus Valley for this animal to have been able to inhabit it. So here you can see some of the bullocks and buffaloes. Now, how do we know that some of these were being used in traction and things like that? So here we can use some of those other sources, like we have a lot of terracotta animal carts, which were probably used as toy carts by the children. And these models which are there definitely tell us about the kind of wheeled transport which was being used. And bullocks might have been one of the major transporters. It is believed that although both trade was being carried out externally and internally, and how are the goods being transported? Since a lot of trade was happening over land, it is quite possible that bullocks as well as buffaloes might have been used in traction for pulling bullock carts and taking material across to other regions, from one region to another region. And transportation must have definitely relied on keeping such kind of bullocks at many of the settlements just for this particular purpose. Now, coming to the recent studies of the kind of studies which have been going on, I've just picked up a few ones which are there. The foremost is the identification of zebu domestication in this valley. Now, this particular humped cattle which we have is also known as Bos indicus. Basically, there are two varieties of cattle today in the world. That is Bos taurus, which is found only in Europe, and Bos indicus, which is found in mostly South Asia, Southeast Asia. And so where did it originate? So people have been working on this, and that is why it leads us to Mehergarh, where meadow, because Mehergarh, since it has got these very early dates and it has also got the remains of this animal, especially from it was identified from its bifid thoracic vertebra, as well as you can see this object which is not very clear, but this is the orbital rim of the eye orbit of Bos indicus, from which we can identify and say that it belongs to Bos indicus, because the ones which are there, say for buffalo or for the other Bos taurus, it is very, very different. So on the basis of this, they have been able to identify it and say that this is Bos indicus. And people like Richard Meadow feel that Bos indicus has its origins in the Indus Valley civilization, and maybe places like Mehergarh might have been the probable areas. Another area which they had also, both Meadow and Patel have identified, is North Gujarat, where they were also finding a lot of both domesticated variety as well as wild variety of these cattle. So on this basis, they felt that North Gujarat could also be a potential area. But now I also feel that the northern India, that is places like Haryana, could also be a good location for domestication of this particular animal. And the recent studies show that there must not have been just one area of domestication. There must have been various areas within the Indus Valley which prompted domestication. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Hello.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah.
Time?
Yeah. Can you give me 5 minutes? I'm just.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is one important study which has been done, and it is also being supplemented with DNA studies. But unfortunately, no ancient DNA studies have been done on archaeozoological material. It is mostly done on modern material, which has been used for supporting this particular evidence. Then another particular analysis, which is being now very frequently being sort of applied in archaeozoological research, is stable isotope analysis. So stable isotope analysis are nothing but it is used for understanding, estimating paleo diet, understanding a distribution of whether people were eating more of marine food versus terrestrial food. It is used in paleo environmental reconstruction, paleo temperature, mobility, and other aspects like weaning. So what are stable isotopes? So to very briefly to tell you, stable isotopes, these are elements of, say, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, strontium, which are already sort of in the air around us. And we are all the time eating them in some form or the other. We drink water, we inhale oxygen, we inhale carbon dioxide. So these isotopes are inhaled by humans as well as plants, by animals. And the stable isotopes, because being stable, they do not change, unlike the unstable ones. So they tend to be remaining in a very constant fashion in the animal world, in the animal bodies as well as the human bodies. And in the past, whenever an animal or a human has ingested some water which has contained these things, will be preserved within the body of that particular animal. And later on, if one studies those isotopes and gets a whole measurement of the kind of deposition which was there, we are able to understand things like, say, about the climate and how much of rainfall was there, whether the conditions were very dry or arid, or was there too much rainfall, and so forth. So basically, there are two types of isotopes. You have stable and unstable. Unstable ones are the radioactive isotopes. So they are not of much use to us. We can only use them for dating. So this particular analysis was used at the site of Birana, from where we have been able to show that this was done basically on teeth. Now, again, stable isotope analysis, it's not a very easy analysis, and especially in South Asian conditions, sometimes the bone preservation for such kind of studies may not be very, even for DNA studies, it's not very conducive. So you find that you have to really struggle a lot with the bones, teeth. So what we were successful was with teeth, cattle teeth, and from this we were able to show that the site of Birana, which started somewhere around the 7th millennium BC, in its early stages, it shows that there was definitely a very, very wet kind of conditions when the climate was very congenial. There was a lot of rainfall, the rivers had a lot of water, that is the Ghaggar river had a lot of water, and because of which this settlement started developing. And during its mature phase, by the mature phase, we find that the monsoon which was there was slowly declining, and because of which an aridity was setting in, and the whole settlement comes to an end by the late Harappan period. and after which it is abandoned. Now this is a picture which is seen at many of the sites all across the Indus Valley, that by say the 2200 BC onwards, we start seeing a real deterioration in the conditions of most Harappan settlements, and what we refer to as the late Harappan phase. And the many factors have been attributed of these. Climate change is one very big factor. So this was one very interesting study which we have done for finding out the thing. And what was interesting about this is much of the proxies which have been used for doing these kind of climatic studies for the Harappan civilization have been mainly done from ocean cores and sediments, nothing to do with archaeological material. So here we have archaeozoological material which was from an excavated context and from stratigraphic controls, and it was used for getting this information. There is another so these are some of the studies which you have. You can also go through the paper, which will give you an idea about the study which is being done. Then there was another interesting study which has been done by Brad Chase, that is use of strontium isotopes. Now it is always interesting to see that when people were keeping herds of cattle at a particular settlement, were they keeping them from their birth or were they getting them from somewhere else? So strontium analysis is generally used to find out migration patterns, and this was particularly used for the site of Bagasra, where it is seen that the kind of fodder which was being given to both the cattle and sheep goat, it shows that the cattle were fed on a fodder which was from some other place, whereas the sheep and goat were supposed to have been bred locally. That means they must have been kept and sort of bred from their very childhood at the site itself. So this also gives a lot of interesting information about the kind of exchange systems which were going on during the Indus Valley, especially during the mature Harappan period, that it's not necessary that all the settlements were keeping cattle and sheep, say cattle herds. They might have been getting it in exchange from, say, some kind of pastoralist. So this was one very interesting study. Another interesting study which has also been done is on dung, trying to identify, again using stable isotopes, to see the kind of dung, and from it trying to find out what was the diet of the animal and from where they might have come and things like that. Again, it was also used for understanding meat consumption patterns, that in certain areas, in certain phases, people were eating more of cattle meat, or did the intensity increase, and so forth. Now, my last example which I'm giving you is of a very recent study which we have done for the site of Dhulavira. I've been looking at the shell remains from this particular site since 2014. And here, Dhulavira is also very interesting because here lies another. I'm sorry for this. I live near an airport and we always have these flights going and coming. So please excuse this noise. So Dhulavira is also another very interesting site which also saw a very large scale exploitation of different kinds of animal resources. At the same time, it was a very large, one of the 5th largest urban centers. And again, this site also has a very early beginning, somewhere around the 4th millennium, and it continues right up till the late Harappan times, after which it sort of declines. So what were the conditions around Dhulavira we wanted to study? And here we used, so today if you look at Dhulavira, it is located in a very, very arid part of Gujarat, that is in the Kutch region, located in the Great Run of Kutch, which is nothing but a vast expanse of dried salt waste. And so it's difficult to imagine that such a big establishment had survived in this particular region. So what our research shows that such conditions were not there in the past. Definitely, it was having a much more wet environment where there was much more rainfall. The rivers which are there flowing around Dhulavira had much more river water, which were mixing up with there was a lot of influx of tidal action also. The tides were coming in, and because of this mixing up, there was estuaries, there was presence of mangroves in and around the site, which the people were exploiting for their wood, for exploiting these kind of shells, which I have shown you one particular shell called as the Terebrelia palustris, which is there. And so this kind of exploitation was going on, and which sort of gradually declined by the late Harappan times when sort of aridity set in, and this we have learned from the stable isotope oxygen records which we have generated from this particular shows, which shows that there was definitely so much of enrichment that there was a lot of desiccation of the whole area. A lot of freshwater influx came to sort of nearly a stop, and because of which brackish water increased, and due to which the whole landscape over the years and over the centuries has been completely modified. So this was one study which has been done in the very recent past. And with this I conclude my talk.